I will now introduce our next lecturer, Darrel Rutkin, who's going to talk about reflections on the marginalization of astrology. Darrel is also a researcher, main researcher on the ERC-funded project Early Modern Cosmology, Institutions and Metaphysics at Foscari, University of Venice. And he has recently published the first volume of his long work, Sapienza Astrologica, Astrology, Magic and Natural Knowledge, from circa 1250 to 1800. So Darrel, welcome, and I'll give you the stage.
Great. Thank you so much, Luis, and thank you for organizing this wonderful workshop, and thank you to my distinguished colleagues who are also on this panel. On what I think is one of the most important unresolved problems in the history of astrology, and I dare say also in the history of science, as well as in the history of knowledge overall, namely an accurate account of a and its ultimate removal from the pre-modern map of legitimate knowledge as it was itself transformed into the modern one during the Enlightenment. This is the 10-minute version. There is much more to say. There was once a time, not so very long ago, when astrology was studied, practiced, and taught in the finest medieval, Renaissance, and early modern European universities, where it was embedded within and both generated and integrated many types of scientific knowledge, especially in mathematics, natural philosophy, and medicine. In the modern and postmodern world, on the other hand, astrology was delegitimized and removed from the map of legitimate knowledge, thereby becoming a member of the so-called occult or esoteric sciences, and ultimately the alternative language of knowledge and practice that she is today, in a process that is not yet fully understood. This epistemological shift, astrology's downgrading and removal from the map of legitimate knowledge, marked an epoch-making transformation from pre-modern to modern in the history of science. I believe, therefore, that astrology can provide a revealing case study in both the history of science and in the history of knowledge. In this talk, I will present some of the new understanding that is emerging about the medieval, Renaissance, and early modern map of knowledge from circa 1250 to circa 1600 and beyond, that had astrology as the integrating center of a broad range of knowledge systems. Then, astrology was not in any way on the margins, where she is now, disreputable and illegitimate, a status that has in many cases simply been retrojected into the past. In reconstructing this story, I have tried to reframe our understanding of the medieval, Renaissance, and early modern knowledge matrix in both conceptual and institutional respects, out of which modern science was born. Thus, I use astrology as a revealing case study to focus on the shifting epistemic frameworks within dynamic hierarchies of knowledge, and in particular, how epistemic frameworks are reordered over time by exploring the complex and contingent historical processes whereby previously centrally configured and legitimate knowledge and practice became delegitimized. Although astrology was the queen of the mathematical disciplines for Regiomontanus in 1464, she most assuredly no longer holds that status today. I will now briefly describe astrology's places within the medieval map of knowledge, within three distinct scientific disciplines: mathematics, natural philosophy, and medicine, as they were taught in the finest medieval and Renaissance universities. In the mathematics curriculum, astrology as a theoretical and practical doctrine was taught as a central feature of the science of the stars, along with mathematical astronomy, but only after the propaedeutic study of arithmetic and geometry. Astrology's foundations in nature were taught in the natural philosophy course by reading core texts by Aristotle, including the De Caelo and On Generation and Corruption. In the medical course, in one of its most important practical applications, astrology was studied together with Galen's influential On Critical Days. These curricular patterns were established in the 13th century and were further developed during the 14th and 15th centuries. In fact, the basic curricular structures for astrology's configuration within mathematics, natural philosophy, and medicine are clearly specified in the influential 1405 statutes for the University of Bologna. Establishing and properly historicizing this astrologizing scientific system serves two fundamental and interrelated purposes in my reconstruction. First, it identifies and articulates astrology's primary conceptual and institutional foundations within the medieval map of knowledge. Secondly, it provides an interpretive framework for analyzing in detail astrology's gradual dislodging from this central position by addressing its appropriation, marginalization, and ultimate disappearance in university teaching in relation to each of these scientific disciplines. In fact, this remarkably stable and deeply integrated medieval system of knowledge and practice was passed on with some modifications, but essentially the same structure, to early modern Europe, where it underwent new and fundamentally transformative development. These stable and integrating conceptual and institutional structures established and secured astrology's scientific foundations within the economy of nature as a centrally positioned and integrating feature of God's very deliberate and exceedingly wise creation. As I have established in detail elsewhere, a nested and strikingly architectonic structure seems to emerge, in which astrology has solid conceptual and/or institutional foundations in two major areas within the medieval, Renaissance, and early modern map of knowledge that we would call natural knowledge or science and theology. Astrological theory and practice were thus supported, maintained, and at least sometimes defended by means of these well-established structures of astrologizing Aristotelian natural knowledge, integrated first with Roman Catholic and later with a Melanchthonian version of Lutheran theology, both of which used astrology to articulate their closely related views of divine providence. Astrology was thus in fundamental ways subordinated to and dependent upon, or perhaps better, subalternated to, both science and theology for its practical and epistemological legitimacy. Magic, however, presents a different aspect when viewed through the focus of Imogenes Astronomicae, or talismans. In this configuration, magic did not provide astrology's foundations in any respect, as it sometimes claimed. Rather, magic was itself dependent on practical astrology, especially elections, which thus provided magic practical, and ontological foundation. This strong linkage between astrology and magic, then, seems to have provided the fundamental pivot in the Enlightenment, when astrology finally lost both her scientific and theological foundations within the map of legitimate knowledge, as science and theology were themselves both profoundly transformed under the increasing and multifold pressures of incipient modernity. Astrology thus seems to have survived this epoch-making rupture by linking up much more closely with magic and the other so-called occult or esoteric sciences, traditions, or currents. This Enlightenment story of appropriation, reconfiguration, and rejection is worthy of further exploration. In this epoch-making adaptation, astrology found a new cultural evolutionary niche within the rapidly transforming map of knowledge and culture in which to survive her transition into the modern world, where she is currently alive and well and active in many parts of the world, both East and West, although at least in the West, lacking in most of her former conceptual and institutional legitimacy. Due to her deliberate suppression and erasure from the map of legitimate knowledge and practice during the Enlightenment, astrology has become a sort of blind spot in both the histories of science and of knowledge more generally. I, for one, am curious to see what will happen to our broader understanding as these suppressed memories are more fully recovered. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Darrel. Thank you for your contribution. Again, a topic that still needs a lot to be figured out, exactly the mechanism surrounding all this transformation in the end of the early modern era. Yeah, thank you.